Chapter 9 talks about cognitive and perceptual characteristics of individuals with developmental disabilities. So where we start is looking at the intersection between the different mild disabilities, so that characteristics of intellectual disabilities and characteristics of learning disabilities and attention deficit and emotional and behavior disorders overlap, that there are many characteristics that each of those types of disabilities share. What is learning? Well, learning is an active process that leads to lasting changes in your knowledge base and then stable changes in your behavior. It's the process of coming to understand, and it is a process. It's not a matter of 1 minute you know it and the next minute you don't, or the other way around, 1 minute you don't know it and the next minute you do, but it's a matter of that we begin to notice things, and then after we notice them, then we start looking at the aspects of them, and then later we come to understand them. So there are a couple of big theorists that talk about learning. Piaget, you've probably had in some of your other classes, his theories are called biological constructivism. And then Lev Vygotsky and his theories are called social constructivism. So here's what Piaget says. He says that it's a cycle, that you go from equilibrium to experience to disequilibrium to adaptation. This is how it works. That in equilibrium, what we have is everything is balanced. Everything is right where it should be, and you feel very comfortable with where you are. Then you get new information, and when you get new information, your brain has to differentiate between the new information it's hearing and the old information that seemed so stable. And at that point, we have disequilibrium. In other words, things are out of balance. And so what we're going to do is we're going to use organization and adaptation to try to bring ourselves back into equilibrium. So we do two things. One is assimilation and the other is accommodation. So with assimilation, what I do is I take the new information and I find a place to put it. So if you think about it on your computer, that you have this new file and you find an old folder to put that file in where it will fit. That's assimilation. Accommodation is where you have to change what you have already known to fit that new information in. And so you might have to rename the file or combine two files to be able to put this new information into a folder. Once we have done that, we've assimilated and or accommodated, we may actually do both, then we have the new information is now into a schema or a pattern of information, and that leads us back to equilibrium, where we'll stay for a while until new information comes. Piaget said that there were 4 stages of learning, that in the sensory motor stage, which is birth to 2, you learn through sensory experience and motor activity. And so when you watch a baby lying there in a crib, it doesn't seem like they're doing much. Their arms are pumping, their legs are pumping, they're looking up at the sky. You've got the mobile hanging over their head. They're reaching for the mobile. But in the process of that, they're learning how their arms work, how their legs work. They're beginning to understand distances. They begin to understand size, sound, color, light, all those things they're learning in the sensory motor stage. In the preoperational stage, the child begins to use symbols, but he's still dependent on direct experience for learning. So when you see pretend play in age 2 to 7 range, they don't pretend things they've never heard of, they pretend things that they've seen. And so if you go into a preschool classroom, you'll see a kitchen center, and you'll see an art center, and you'll see a building center, and it's all based on experiences the children already have. And with those experiences, they're building their world by imagining what it would be like. In concrete operations, which starts around age 7 and goes through 14, so basically elementary school, the child begins to use logic to create new concepts, but it's still related to the here and now. And so they say, well, if this is true and this is true, then that would be true. So they begin to be able to see things that they've never directly experienced, but they're still basing their understanding of things they've never experienced on things they have experienced. Formal operations, the PowerPoint says 14 plus. There's a lot of research to indicate now that a lot of people, even your age, are not to formal operations, that formal operations occurs much later in some people than in others, but it's the idea that you can think abstractly and logically without having experience to guide you through that thinking. Vygotsky looked at constructivism very differently. What he looked at was the idea of scaffolding, or building things on top of other things, and his big principle was called the zone of proximal development. So what he basically said was that there's a level where I simply can't do a skill, and then there's a level that I can do the skill with help, and then there's this level where I can do the skill completely independently. And so what he suggested is where we want to teach children is in that level where they can do it with help. And so in scaffolding, what we do is we support the learner to actually be able to perform above their independent level, to perform at a level that they can perform with support, and in that way you're kind of leapfrogging from a level of support to a level of mastery, from a level of support to a level of mastery. The novice learner is guided by expert learners, and that's, Vygotsky says, that that's how socially we operate, that we learn from the people that are older than us. So if you had an older brother or sister, then you probably learned to walk and talk earlier than they did because you had them guiding you. Cognitive styles, field dependence versus field independence. So field dependence means that in my cognitive style, I am very much sensitive to the things that are within my vision, within my hearing, within my touch, and those things influence my thinking, whereas a field independent person is able to get into a world of abstraction, and they're able to filter out the things that are directly in their sensory range. Impulsivity versus reflectivity. Now this is as a learning style, and so what we're looking at here is that if I have an impulsive style, which by the way I do, I'm able to respond very quickly. If you give me a multiple choice test, for example, I'm going to be the first person in the room to finish it because I read the question, I answer it, and I move on. I honestly cannot figure out, those of you that take forever to take a multiple choice test, what you're doing. You either know it or you don't know it. Those of you who are reflective, you're saying, well, my goodness, you're not thinking of all the implications. And my response is, right, okay? So what we're looking at here is because I have an impulsive style, then I have a faster response time, but I also have a higher rate of error. If, on the other hand, I have reflective style, I have a slower response time and I have a lower rate of error. But here's the deal. If I truly am impulsive, then if you allow me to use my fast responses, then I'm going to tend to have a lower error rate, just like if you truly are reflective. If I allow you to work within the level that you're in, that if I allow you to slow down and think, you will have lower error rate. And so the important thing is not whether you work quickly or whether you work slowly, but you work in the way that your cognitive style works best. We have a model of cognitive processing. You look at the top and we have external stimulus comes through your sensory register. There's an auditory buffer. There's a visual buffer that kind of keeps things out that are not relevant. You have attention, and then you have perception. Attention is whether you even notice that it's there. Perception is how you see or hear or feel or taste whatever it is that you're doing. The executive function, what it does is it connects the attention to the rehearsal. So in other words, I see it and then I start practicing with what that is. Likewise, I can connect by executive function, I can connect my perception to the rehearsal and the organization and the elaboration. What we have is that this attention and perception comes into our immediate memory. And immediate memory has two components to it. One component is short-term memory, which is what I've got on my screen right now. And then working memory is what I'm actually manipulating on that screen. And that immediate memory, we're going to lose some information there through decay, or if I'm not efficiently controlling what it is that I'm doing. And I can go from immediate memory into output. So you asked me what 3 times 7 is, short-term memory. I process that you're asking me 3 times 7. My working memory says, okay, math facts 21, and I give it to you, and that's all I need to do because I've got that at a level of what we call automaticity. As things go through immediate memory, I'm going to rehearse them, I'm going to organize them, I'm going to elaborate them, and then I'm going to store them into long-term memory. And in long-term memory, I have declarative memories where I can say this is so, procedural memory, this is how I do it, and conditional memory where I put if-then statements in. The sensory register, what happens there is that I have an external stimulus and it leads me to attention and perception. In the immediate memory, I've got short-term memory and working memory that can go into long-term memory. The long-term memory can also connect back into the working memory. So when I gave you the example of 3 times 7, I had to go into long-term memory to pull up what the answer was to that. We have stages of attention. The first is what we call alerting. That's when I come to attention where I recognize there's something I need to look at. Selective attention, where I focus on whatever the stimulus is, and then sustained attention, where I keep paying attention to it. Perception, you've got apprehension. That's where I capture a stimulus into the sensory register. Encoding is where I put it a mental representation so I can store it. And then perceptual integration is where I match what I just saw or heard or felt with something I already had stored in memory. Visual perception and auditory perception and tactile perception all look at discrimination, seeing how one thing's different from the other. Figure ground, how I can see whether something's in the foreground or in the background. Recognizing objects, recognizing things in space, remembering things, and then closing out a thought. Haptic perception includes tactile, which is touch, and kinesthetic, which is movement.